All right, this is part 2 of Reform in the Roaring Twenties, Objective 3. And in the first part, we took a look at the laissez-faire policies of the Roaring Twenties and how those policies developed one of the most prosperous decades we'd ever seen. In the latter part of the decade, 1929 specifically, that's all going to come crashing down. But let's continue on with this here. If you take a look at letter D on the outline. Herbert Hoover, who becomes president in 1928, seemed like the perfect guy to replace Coolidge. He had a lot of Coolidge's same policies and Harding's: keep your hands off the economy, let it do what it's going to do, and everything will be fine. Plus, he was pretty conservative and shy, just like Coolidge was. Coolidge wasn't interested in running for president again, and he had led a lot of prosperity just by sitting back and watching it happen. Hoover seemed like the perfect guy to replace him. If you take a look at D1 on the outline, he's pretty traditional. He's a conservative Quaker. He was born in the Midwest, raised in a rural area. He's really kind of the perfect guy to replace Coolidge. As a young man, he had been an orphan, and he actually relied on himself. He was very independent and worked his way into Stanford University, which is a pretty substantial accomplishment. Graduated with high honors there and became a self-made millionaire. Now, of course, under those circumstances, he's going to believe in a very hands-off policy to government. Just let people build themselves up. These policies are going to stick with him. He was very adamant about it, and these policies are going to stick with him well into his presidency and may have been part of his undoing later on. Now, overall, he had always been pretty shy. People thought he was very good at his jobs. He'd been on the cabinets of Harding and Coolidge, and he'd led relief efforts after World War I, which he became very famous for, became known as Herbert the Humanitarian. But he'd never really been interested in running for office himself, just because he was pretty shy, and the big thing was that he didn't like criticism. That's going to be something that will be a problem for him later on. But it didn't seem to matter, because if you look at D4 here, the Democrats had nominated a guy named Alfred E. Smith for the election. Now, first of all, he's a notorious alcoholic. Everybody knew that he was a drinker and that he had a problem with it, especially during a time when you're not supposed to be drinking at all, Prohibition. And he lost a little support because he was Catholic. Ever since 1860, southern states had voted solidly Democratic. If you were a Democrat, you were going to get all of those states. But he lost some support in the South, primarily because he was Roman Catholic. And at that time, Protestant ideas still dominated the South and, frankly, a lot of the country. The first Catholic president we would ever have would be John F. Kennedy in 1960, and that just barely. So him being a Roman Catholic didn't help things for him too much, and he lost some support in the South that traditionally would have gone to the Democrats. Also, he had kind of a funny accent, and people did enjoy listening to him talk, and the radio, the new invention of the radio, or mass marketing of the radio, was being used in campaigns. Hoover just sounded better on the radio. That, I think, is noteworthy as well. As a result, despite the fact that he'd never really sought the presidency, Hoover wins in an absolute landslide, 444 to 87 in the Electoral College. This would be the last time things would be this positive. After this, they'd go south pretty quickly. It kind of all started, if you take a look at letter E, it basically starts with the Agricultural Marketing Act. It was a setup designed to help farmers out. Again, an idea of buying and storing and selling surplus crops. Now, in theory, if there's no surplus, there's no reason to decrease the price. In reality, the government got more surplus than it could absolutely handle. As a result, farmers never did see their prices go up. They had no choice but to keep their prices way, way down, because the government simply could not buy up all the grain surplus that was out there. So the whole Agricultural Marketing Act failed, and as a result, led to some other economic problems. Hoover once again believes in laissez-faire policies, and on October 29th, it absolutely, completely comes crashing down. People started gathering outside of the New York Stock Exchange because they heard that there was some difficulty going on, and people started making runs on banks to see if the banks still had their money. They were worried that they had given out too many bad loans, and as it turned out, everybody was right. On October 29th, Black Tuesday, 1929, the stock market did, in fact, crash, as 16 million shares of overpriced stock were attempted to be sold. Now, we went over this during the economics unit, so I'm not going to get into all the details of what happened, other than to say we just oversupplied too many things and lost a lot of jobs because nobody was buying them. If you want a greater explanation of that, I can go over it in class. But what I want to concentrate on here is what Hoover basically did about it. Immediately after the crash, millions of Americans lose everything. Lines for relief, food, whatever, start to form all over the country. People just trying to get anything they could to eat, and a lot of times there wasn't enough food, or as you see in the sign there, coffee, donuts, or soup to go around. It was common to see people resorting to anything they could do to make any kind of money they could, like selling apples on a street corner for 5 cents a piece. Or people walking around with signs begging for work. This particular man is from Detroit, and he's trying to find any work that he can. Even having kids get into the act as they're trying to grow up during this time and deal with the fact that dad doesn't have a job and they may have to go live with somebody else. This photograph, called Migrant Mother by a lady named Dorothea Lange, is in the Smithsonian right now as a famous Depression-era photograph. This lady, the morning of this picture, had killed a bird so that her kids would have something to eat after a farmer had chased her out of his field for trying to steal beans. Essentially, everybody across the nation is suffering, and it appears that Hoover doesn't really know what to do about it. His common stance to everyone, if you take a look at E2C, his common stance to everyone is that prosperity is right around the corner. Prosperity will quickly return as long as the government just stays out of the economy. But when he started to see the numbers, he started to change his mind. By 1930, 20% of banks had failed. Unemployment was at 25%. 1 out of every 4 Americans was out of work. Here in Michigan, we have a 9% unemployment rate at the current time of this filming. And we get very upset about that. But that's 1 out of 10, and it's a major problem. Imagine if it was 1 out of every 4 people out of work across the country. People start blaming Hoover for their problems. They have Hoovervilles like this one in urban areas, shanty towns where unemployed people lived. And it wasn't just a city problem. Even out in the rural countryside, you found Hoovervilles. Basically, everybody who lived in these shanty towns were people who had once been part of the middle class, who had taken out loans and borrowed everything and now couldn't find a way out of it. And without any government assistance, without any social programs, safety nets, welfare, food stamps, none of those things existed. And without those things, they were having a hard time getting by. People started sleeping under newspapers called Hoover blankets, or holding their pockets inside out to show that they didn't have any money and therefore please don't mug me. Those were known as Hoover Flags. And for his part, Hoover felt the sympathy for it and tried some other policies, but he did one other thing that really doesn't work very well. It's called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff of 1930. And this was supposed to be, now his intention was that it would be a reasonable tariff that would help out farmers, keep the tariff low, so that American businesses wouldn't be so protected and farmers wouldn't have to pay such high prices for their tractors and land and things like that. But by the time it got done with Congress, it ends up being one of the highest tariffs in history. Foreign nations got really upset because our depression had caused a worldwide depression, and so every country in the world was lowering their tariffs to help each other out of it. Meanwhile, we were raising ours and making it difficult for people to sell here. As a result, nobody wins. Foreign nations needed us, but they weren't willing to trade with us anymore if we were going to raise tariffs. And they basically said, your economic problems are yours. If you want to handle them yourself, go ahead. You won't get any help from us. But it didn't help those nations either because they needed our trade. Everybody lost because of this. And Hoover also set up the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to provide businesses with loans. The idea was to get them started and provide jobs, but common people wanted their money. Take a look at E5. If you look down there, this is about the bonus army of 1932. A group of veterans from World War I who were due a bonus in 1945, but like everybody else, they needed their money. So 20,000 of them parked themselves on the steps of the Capitol, sleeping on the lawn overnight. They had also set up shanty towns, and those, when Hoover finds out about this, he orders them dispersed. But a young general named Douglas MacArthur, who would later be a major player in World War II in the Pacific, goes in there and overdoes it a little bit, and two people end up dead, plus an infant ends up getting killed as well. It was a disastrous stain on Hoover's presidency. And even though he didn't really want this to happen, MacArthur was a rising star in the military, so of course all the blame got pinned on Herbert Hoover. By 1932, Hoover, who had won in a landslide, was now one of the most despised people in American history. Not intentional, and he's a good guy, just a wrong place, wrong time type of thing. A matter of fact, one guy said that dogs even took an instinctive dislike to him, and I'm glad to see in this picture that that obviously wasn't true. But nonetheless, Hoover was in for trouble in 1932 in the election. People were upset with him. Everything could be blamed on Herbert Hoover, and no matter what he did, it seemed like he wasn't going to have a chance. He won by a historical landslide in 1928, and he would lose by a bigger one in 1932. Thanks for listening.